Welcome to the ninth week after Pentecost. It's Tuesday, July the 23rd, 2024. This is the Manna at the Tap podcast, where we as a community actively seek the spiritual nourishment our souls crave. I'm Gloria, your fellow traveler on this spiritual journey, and together we guide each other, offering and receiving insights and interpretations from our daily lectionary readings. It's not just about reading the text, it's about actively engaging with it, and your interpretations enrich this journey. Today's lectionary text is Psalm 61. This brief prayer, with 8 verses, tells the tale of the difficult days David experienced after his horrific act with Bathsheba. We can thus divide this psalm as follows. David cried out to be heard by God in verses 1 to 3. He communicates his hope to ever dwell in the Lord's presence in verses 4 and 5. Then he transitioned from praying for himself to praying for himself as king, God's promise to raise from his family line someone who would be on the throne. And that's in verse 6 to 8. Now, we've been learning there are no isolated, stand-alone psalms. So let's explore the nearby psalms and what they reveal. We kind of have to go all the way back to Psalm 42 to 49, because these are the psalms that mark the beginning of David's reign as king. Worshiping God was very important to him. So he appointed the Levites to be a part of the worship team after they successfully brought the Ark of the Covenant home to Jerusalem. In Psalm 50, David names 2 senior worship leaders, Asaph and his brother. Then, in Psalm 51, we find David confessing his sin against God through his savage act against Bathsheba. Psalm 52 to 59, which follows, speak of a difficult time for David. But in Psalm 60, David seems to be back in command, and Yahweh has come to his military aid. And now to our lectionary reading for today, Psalm 61. David calls on the Lord for deliverance for himself and as king, his confidence that God will not cast him away, but will keep his promise of building a dynasty through his family line. And we talked about that yesterday in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So we hear this fear in David, but yet he's holding on with confidence that God will not cast him away, because God will keep God's promise to him. Now let's take a closer look at verses 1 to 3. David calls on God to hear his cry and attend to his distress. He feels distant from God as far as the ends of the earth, representing the realm of death. He feels spiritually separated from God, and he feels faint in heart. His desire is to be led to the rock that was higher, that is, the earth and temple mountains. And he envisioned finding shelter under the wings of God, the place where God gives both safety and stability. And David is looking for God to do that for him. He has known God as a refuge and strong tower in the face of his enemies. His greatest enemy, though, is not the Philistines. His greatest enemy is his evil desires. He has in times past experienced God's presence, God's power, and God's protection. And he is again calling on God to hear his prayer and lead him to a place that is out of the enemy's reach. In verse 4 and 5, David hopes to enjoy God's presence in God's place. Remember, there's no temple built as yet, only the mobile Ark of the Covenant. And David wants to dwell in God's tent forever. These thoughts are overwhelming, and David takes a Selah moment, a pause at the end of verse 4. He wants to keep his commitment to God, and he vows to be submissive to God as God reveals himself to him. And he also granted David the blessing of access to his presence. In the final three verses, verses 6 to 8, we see David moving from asking God to hear him, which God did, to stating his hope and the heritage God gave him as a gift so he could enjoy God's presence. He called on the Lord to not renege on his promise, but to keep his promise that one of his descendants would reign forever, and that God would add years to the king's life so he could remain enthroned before God until the end of the age. David boldly asked the Lord for his loving kindness and truth to protect him as king. God granted David his heart's desire, and David responded by singing the praises of God's name and fulfilling his vow one day at a time. As I reflect on David's perseverance through the difficulties he experienced after sinning with Bathsheba, I realize that David is teaching us that God is a God of second chances. David's sin with Bathsheba did not mean the end of his relationship with God. But David had to be sincere and work to restore that relationship.